Sure, and it's not just reading your book, it's from also listening to you speak at conferences, including the ADI conference last year. And I don't know if you know that this was me, but we went on a walking tour at the end of the conference of London, and we kind of brought up the tail end of the walking tour. And we started talking about kind of the sorts of things that we're talking about today with the different labels of dementia. And he kind of left my head spinning after that, and it's been sort of spinning ever since. So I'm really looking forward to today's presentation to hopefully clarify a few things. Dr. Whitehouse is fortunate. I was going to say we're fortunate to have him in Canada this month, but maybe he's considering himself fortunate as well. He's in Toronto at Baycrest as a strategic advisor in innovation, and he's also a visiting scientist at the Rotman Research Institute in Toronto. I like Dr. Whitehouse because he completely thinks outside of the box, and I think a great example of that is the intergenerational school, which he started with his wife, Catherine, in 1999. This is a very, what would you call it? Well, the school is doing great. The kids in the school are doing great. It's a community school, and where it's intergenerational in that people in their senior years come in and work with and teach for the kids and also learn alongside them. He's author with Danny George of a book called The Myth of Alzheimer's, and if you haven't read it, you will certainly want to after today. It's available on Amazon, but there's the website of his book if you'd like. He's at Case Western Reserve University, and there's what he is professor of, neurology, of course, and you can read everything else. Very impressive list, obviously. And he is still consulting with and caring for individuals with concerns about their cognitive abilities as they age at the University Hospitals of Cleveland. And he's into storytelling. So without further ado, Dr. Whitehouse, please tell us some stories.
Well, thank you, Laura. First, let me say I feel fortunate to be here in Toronto working at Baycrest on a part-time leave of absence from my home university in Cleveland. And very fortunate to be here on this program with all of you, and also to remind ourselves of the important role that people affected by the labels we're going to be talking about in this program play in this vast global response to the challenges that we face with our memories and our thinking at various ages, and particularly as we get older. Let me say that I'm watching the list of people who are in this meeting, and I can't really give out a shout out to all the people whose names I recognize, but we've got Mexico, we've got Palm Springs, we've got Cleveland, we've got Halifax. So those of you who know, or from those cities that I know, greetings, and those of you that I don't know, greetings as well. So let me start by saying that I'm going to be tracking the chat function, and I'll try to incorporate comments as questions you ask in that fashion. But Laura, who's a wonderful host, can see if she wants to interrupt with questions that come up or points of clarification as we go on. I really do want to make this interactive. I specifically chose not to use PowerPoint, not to show you pictures of our wonderful school or anything else, but to really talk to you about words and stories. Words are so important in our lives, and I think it's important to know that words can change. And in many ways, the question we're going to be considering this afternoon, good morning wherever you are, have to do with two particular words, dementia and Alzheimer's disease and their interrelationships. So what I am focusing on is a question that I am frequently asked, frequently comes up in this space, frequently is asked of other opinion leaders, and it's a question we've been asked for 25 years, at least as long as I've been in this field, and that is, what is the relationship between the word dementia and Alzheimer's disease? Are they the same thing? Just how do they relate to each other? There is a simple answer to that question, which I'll give you in a minute, I'll offer to you, but I think as sometimes simple answers are, it's not the full story. And exploring the depths of that question what is the relationship between dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and how have those words changed through time, will give us this spirit that the language we use is powerful, it changes, and we are the people that can change the stories that hopefully will create a more hopeful future. I'm somebody who at Hopkins, where I was trained, felt that we would learn important lessons from the brain. And so I was a brain banker. Now, this is my story. I was very grateful to receive donations from people's families who said, we want to contribute to research by sharing tissue so you could understand what's going on in the brain. And we did that, and we contributed to some understanding of those brain changes. But as I got a bit older and was in the field longer, I returned to my roots. My roots are as a psychologist, and a psychologist interested in language and words. That's what I did my PhD thesis on now a long time ago, and particularly how words are strung together in stories. So my story is of someone who studied the biology of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, but who then said, look, these words really are important to understand their historical roots and where they're taking us. And let me also say that I have been, during this entire time, somebody who has been privileged to help provide care, information to as a clinical neurologist. So I have had the opportunity to learn about and share the stories of many people, and helped a little bit from a medical perspective, but I suspect helped a bit more from the perspective of someone who listens and helps people understand their stories and how their stories can provide them as much hope, more hope in fact, than any medication might offer. So I'm going to pause here just to see if we're doing okay from Laura's perspective before we launch into this question. What's the relationship between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? Laura, any comments or questions at this point?
No, I think we're okay. I just wanted to point out to everybody that, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you have a question or a comment at any time through the presentation, please type it into the chat box. And when it's a good point in the presentation, Dr. Whitehouse will pick up on that and answer it as best he can. Am I right in saying that?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
And somebody asked, I'm not seeing the video of Dr. Whitehouse. We decided not, and Laura's already answered that question. So my apologies. Somebody, Kathy Greenblatt, says there's an echo. So I'm wearing a headset. I'm doing everything that I can to prevent that. So hopefully that'll quiet down. Mm-hmm. All right, yep. Laura, so should we keep going?
Yes, please.
All right, so the standard simple, ostensibly simple answer is that dementia is the broad overarching category that we use to describe people that have thinking difficulties, and that Alzheimer's disease is one type of dementia. So if I were to just draw an analogy to a different kind of diagnostic category that we're all familiar with, people that have headaches, migraine headaches, have a specific kind of headache that fits into the broader category of headaches. So when you go to a doctor because your headaches have gotten bad and you really need some help, they will say, okay, this is the general category of headache. We need to find out what kind you're having so we can find a medicine that helps you specifically. Then when they take a history and maybe do some tests, discover a type of headache, migraine, and they give you a pill for that. So the answer to the question at a simple level is that Alzheimer's disease is a specific kind of dementia. So dementia is Alzheimer's disease plus other things. Well, what are the things that we heard? Well, we've heard about frontal lobe dementia on this program. We've heard about vascular dementia. So the doctor's job is to try to make a diagnosis that adds a degree of narrowness, specification, that allows more specific therapies. But that answer is not entirely satisfactory. it's kind of the simplistic answer that masks a lot of deeper issues around those words. And these words are very powerful because to be told that you have Alzheimer's disease or to be told that you have dementia can have a profound effect on somebody's life. And so we've got to be really careful as doctors when we use words that people don't fully understand. And I'll tell you the bottom line of all this. The reason that people ask this question, and they're given the simple answer, but they still are not satisfied, is I believe that doctors don't fully understand the relationship between dementia and Alzheimer's. These words are changing, and let's talk a little bit about them. So dementia is actually an older word than Alzheimer's disease. It was a word that was invented in the 1850s. And I could tell you a little bit more about that story, but it was in France, it was in England, and it was a category that means that, as I said before, somebody is not able to quite think as clearly as they were before they developed it. So there is this sense of a change. That is to say, somebody had a relatively normal intelligence, and then they lost some of their abilities to use their memories and their words, the kinds of symptoms that we're all familiar with that dementia is characterized by today. But it does mean a loss from a previous state where you were able to perform better. Just to give you a comparison, the word amentia, mentia means thinking basically, amentia means the inability to think from the first place. So we might use a child that's born with mental disabilities, what we would have called mental retardation, somebody who never was fortunate enough to be able to think as well as the average person. And they have that their entire life long. So but dementia means that you have lost something. It means that it's not due to a temporary confusional state. I mean, we all know that if we have a little too much to drink or if we get hit on the head, we might be temporarily dazed or temporarily confused. Dementia is not that temporary confusion. It's a more permanent state. But what we don't often recognize is that dementia can get better if it's treated. So if somebody has an abnormality in their body chemistry, so the body isn't supporting the brain properly, and we correct that chemical abnormality, that dementia can go away. Some people think that all dementias are progressive. That's to say they get worse. Well, I've just said there's one example that it can get better. Another example is when somebody has something like a head injury. A head injury can cause a dementia, but unless the person hits their head again, it doesn't have to get worse. So you can see that dementia has many different meanings with conditions in dementia that can get better, that can stay the same, or that can get worse. So that's a term that has been with us for quite some time. Now that word is changing in an interesting way with a process that the American psychiatrists are about. Some of you may have heard of something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is produced by the American Psychiatric Association. Some of you may already have been reading about the fact that they're changing the word for dementia. And I'm just going to tell you about that change and pause once again to see if there are any questions before we talk about Alzheimer's disease. Now, the reason that they're changing the word dementia is that they are aware that people find that term pretty negative. Frankly, if I misbehaved at home and did something silly, in the English language, my wife, she's never done this, of course, could say, "Oh, Peter, you're behaving in a very demented fashion." It means stupid. It means idiotic. It means not careful thinking. But that's just a general English word. And so it's a general English word that we can use in an insulting way. And again, my wife, even if I deserved it, which I sometimes do, my wife wouldn't use that word because she's too polite and nice to me. But it's a negative word. So Drum roll here, please, Laura. Play the soundtrack. What are the psychiatrists going to use for the word next? Are you ready? Major neurocognitive disorder. That is what they want to change the word to. Neurocognitive means that your thinking is affected by something in the brain. Disorder doesn't mean a disease. It kind of means a problem. And major means it's a pretty bad problem. Now, just to let you know that they haven't forgotten people with milder problems, they have something called minor, now that they've changed it to mild neurocognitive disorder. And so you've got minor or mild and major neurocognitive disorder. The funny story that was told to me by my friend Dilip Justy, who's the president of the American Psychiatric Association, is that they changed the minor to mild because they didn't think that anybody would ever pay someone to get a diagnosis of anything minor. So now it's mild, and it's beginning to sound like mild cognitive impairment, isn't it? Now, I don't know, honestly, whether this is going to catch on, but it tells you something about the fact that words change for various reasons. And let me end this part by saying that this depends on you, not just doctors. We have to have serious conversations about the label doctors use to cause people to have diseases. And I'll end up with just one example that during our lifetimes has been completely transformed, and that is that before 1973, homosexuality was considered a disease in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And boy, have our social attitudes changed about that part of human life and human condition. And the psychiatrists in 1973, in their wisdom, decided to take that out of their diagnostic manual. That's just another illustration of how words can change over time. So let's just pause once again and see how that people are reacting to it. And by the way, let me just say that somebody said, is disorder any better than dementia? Is this any better? Is this progress? Well, I think I'm glad you're asking those questions, because I think that we're not entirely clear at all that it's a better response. Maybe it's just ducking the issues, and the issues have to do with stigma and our reaction to people that have these labels. I'm going to pause again, Laura, see where we are.
Oh, we're doing great. And there was also, Brenda, I love your question. What will the abbreviation be? I think we could probably have some fun with that. She's suggesting MND. So I'm sure somebody will come up with something. Peter, I don't know if this is the right time to ask this, but you could also maybe file this away for later in the presentation. CJ from Ottawa asks if it's possible to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and then 10 years later find out that it was a misdiagnosis. I think there's probably a few people here who might have that question about misdiagnosis and overlapping diagnoses and things like that.
That's a very good question, and I think the answer is yes. And I think there's a great danger there's going to be more misdiagnosis in the future. And let me explain that as a part of my discussion of the new ways we're thinking about so-called Alzheimer's disease. Now, and that is, I'll give you the bottom line of that and then explain it a bit more. Doctors are always trying to diagnose things earlier and earlier. Now, on the face of it, and by the way, I'm debating somebody in Vancouver in October about the value of early diagnosis. Now, everybody on this, most of people feel that early diagnosis is a good thing. And let me just tell you that if your child has a brain infection like meningitis, or if you're having a chest pain and you're having a heart attack, let me say there are some clear-cut examples in medicine where you want to get to a hospital quickly and you want to get that antibiotic or you want to get that blood thinner started. However, with early diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, the earlier and earlier you get, the harder it becomes. And when it becomes hard, the chance of misdiagnosis becomes greater. So the misdiagnosis can occur partly because somebody tried to make a diagnosis earlier, and partly for the other part of this story, which is we don't really know what Alzheimer's disease is. So hold on to your seats for that. So let's go back to a story that most of you, I'm sure, are somewhat familiar with, and that is where the term Alzheimer's disease came from. And that was from Dr. Alois Alzheimer, who was practicing in the early 1900s in Germany. And he was a clinician, and he was also trying to make his career looking at brains. And he was privileged to take care of a woman by the name of Augusta Dieter, who had at an early age, in her 50s, this dementia that we've talked about. In her case, it was a progressive loss of language skills and memory skills and other things. And Dr. Alzheimer thought that this was a little strange to see this in a young woman, and he wrote this up as a pre-senile dementia. So dementia, we've understood, is the type of dementia. Senility is a word we don't use so much, but basically all he was saying was this was occurring in a younger person under the age of 65. And when Dr. Alzheimer got the privilege to examine Augusta Dieter's brain, he saw the same things we look for today, which are plaques and tangles. These are microscopic features that occur in the brains of people that have Alzheimer's. But he wasn't sure that he had described a separate disease because it looked like the plaques and tangles that were seen in older people. And he wasn't sure enough that he himself claimed that it was a separate disease. But medical politics always plays a role in this, and his boss was a very influential man in Munich, Emil Kraepelin, who was writing in about the 8th edition of the most influential textbook in psychiatry in the world at that time. And he decided in 1910 to name this disease after his young colleague, Dr. Alzheimer. I will tell you that even Kraepelin wasn't sure he'd described this, but they wanted to make a mark. They wanted to get their department in Munich on the map by describing these new diseases. This hasn't changed much, by the way, and unfortunately in today's era we've got the drug companies helping us invent new diseases as well, something we might have a chance to talk about. So really Alzheimer's disease wasn't discovered exactly, it was invented. And think about that for a minute. Are diseases things that are found in nature that are somehow hidden under a rock that a careful doctor finds and discovers? Or are they words? Are they things that we label the world with that we think help people, but sometimes maybe we have to be cautious because they don't, particularly when words mask our ignorance. Now, what have we learned about this term Alzheimer's disease since it was described over 100 years ago now? Well, one thing I think everybody agrees, and this is not controversial, although when we wrote a book called The Myth of Alzheimer's Disease, the title attracted a lot of attention. But part of the myth is that Alzheimer's disease is one thing. There are hundreds of genetic mutations. There are many different brain changes. There are clinical differences between people. So often when I ask this question, people say, oh, you know, I have Alzheimer's disease, or I've been told I have Alzheimer's disease, but my condition is very different than other people who I have the opportunity to meet. So this notion that in many levels Alzheimer's disease is probably not one thing is something we're just waking up to. People call it a syndrome. People say they're Alzheimer's diseases. And so when somebody says we're going to find one pill to fix Alzheimer's disease, and our wonderful, well, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, our friends at the National Alzheimer's Association who are constantly talking about a cure, they really should be talking about cures if they want to find a cure, because there are multiple conditions. Let me tell you the other thing that I think is a bit mythical, and that is the relationship between Alzheimer's disease and aging. Now, some of you on this call have been diagnosed like Augusta Dieter at an early age, and you're saying to me, well, this can't be related to aging. I'm a young person with this label. And I will say to you, well, yes, that's true, but unfortunately, sometimes there are forms of illnesses that affect people younger in age that really become much more common later in age. Think of diabetes. Diabetes becomes more common with age, but there are young people that have it too. So I personally think that Alzheimer's disease is very closely related to aging processes. And frankly, despite the fact that we spent, and I'm going to say this figure slowly, tens of billions of dollars trying to find one diagnostic test that allows you to say, no, you've got an old brain and you've got an Alzheimer's brain, nobody has found that test. And in fact, nobody has found the way to do that, even if you have a brain in front of you. Because many of you will have heard of the NUN study. The NUN study is just one of many studies that have shown that you can have a pretty good memory and still have a brain full of plaques and tangles when that is examined at autopsy. So the new neuropathology guidelines for Alzheimer's disease, quite frankly, say, honestly now for the first time, that we can't make a definite diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease at the autopsy, because if the pathologist who's examining the brain doesn't ask the family or the doctor whether this person had memory problems, he could see Alzheimer's under the microscope, but the person wouldn't have memory problems. Isn't this a fantastic shift? Isn't this how a word can change just as Alzheimer's is changing? I'm going to say one more thing about Alzheimer's and pause again. And the question that was asked, is there a line between Alzheimer's and mild cognitive disorder? Or is it what we call a continuum? It's a continuum. There is no test, no neuroimaging test, no blood test, no spinal fluid test that says for sure that there's a clear and absolute difference between somebody with Alzheimer's and somebody who doesn't have it. But that does get to us. By the way, people are asking about Naomi Feil's validation approach. I'm proud to say Naomi is a friend and a colleague in Cleveland. You're absolutely right to ask these questions. If we think of Alzheimer's disease differently, aren't we looking for different approaches? Isn't the hope going to be find, yes, in doctors and scientists, but not all of our hopes put into that particular approach? So let me tell you about what I'm going to call a little bit of craziness at the other end of Alzheimer's. We've just talked about the fact that at autopsy you can't be sure what the plaques and tangles mean. Now, another drum roll here, because we have just invented, oh good, somebody's helping me out here. We have now invented another category of Alzheimer's disease, and it is called asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease. Yes. Alzheimer's disease with a normal memory. Alzheimer's disease with no word-finding difficulties. Alzheimer's disease that is waiting to develop. How on earth can you decide that somebody has a disease without people having symptoms or the family complaining? Well, guess what? This is the world of the modern medicine. This is the world of biomarkers. So let's explore what that word means. Marker just means it's a marker for the disease. A clinical marker would be memory problems. A biomarker is a measurement that you make of the brain, directly or indirectly. So some of you may have heard about amyloid imaging and the fact that our government wisely decided not to pay for that. Why was that a wise decision? Because even if we can see amyloid in somebody that doesn't have any symptoms, that does not mean that person is going to develop a dementia, clinical symptoms. It's worrisome. I prefer not to have my amyloid in my brain. But basically, we've just already talked about the fact that you can have amyloid in your brain at the end of your life at autopsy and not have clinical symptoms. So how on earth can they possibly look at amyloid in somebody who has any symptoms and say that this is a diagnostic test for Alzheimer's? Frankly, the doctors are desperate. And my heart goes out to them. They really want to develop medications to help people. But they fail. They fail with amyloid drugs. And when you fail in a drug study, there are a couple of explanations that you grasp for. One is that you used the wrong dose. The other is that you didn't give it early enough. And that's the excuse that's being given for creating this category of asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease. Maybe we have to give drugs to people that don't have any symptoms. Well, this gets pretty scary because we're talking about powerful drugs that potentially could harm people. We still don't understand what amyloid does in our brains normally. It plays some normal role. And in some of the drug trials that have been done, amyloid vaccines, that's a word some of you will have heard, have actually caused people harm. So to give people who don't have any symptoms, who might develop a dementia or Alzheimer's disease later on, is something that we should be really questioning. So this is how the world of Alzheimer's is changing. We're not sure at the end of life how to make the diagnosis anymore, but we're going gung-ho trying to label people with this condition, these Alzheimer's diseases before they develop symptoms. So I hope nobody fell off their chair and everybody's following this story carefully. You're following it carefully. I'm hoping I'm doing a good job communicating. But let me pause once again to remind you we've gone through the two important words here, dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And when we're asking the relationships of the two, we can see that this is a bit more complicated than perhaps the simple question at first reveals. I'm going to pause again.
Okay, I think we're doing great. Does anybody have any questions? Because you can type them in now. Brenda has a question. She said in the 90s it was between the betas and the tauists. What about the tau tangles that are now making a resurgence?
Right. So that's a very good question. It's funny sometimes in science, we're supposed to be so rational, and we're supposed to make all these decisions based on data. Well, the words I use are beta amyloid protein and tau. The beta amyloid protein is associated with plaques, and the tau is associated with tangles. So you've actually got the Baptists, the beta amyloid protein Baptists, and the Taoists fighting. And it's almost more a religious warfare. And let me just tell you one other historical fact that goes way back to the beginning. Remember I described Auguste Dieter, the first patient that Alzheimer's described, having plaques and tangles. Well, guess what? The second patient that he studied, when he examined the brain tissue, only had plaques. So the wars, and they sometimes considered this, between the two religions, the Baptists and the Taoists, really started very early on. And I think many people actually believe that it's neither the Baptists or the Taoists who had the answer. Somebody thought it was synapses, the connections between nerve cells that were impaired. So I thought we should have wars between Baptists, Taoists, and sinners, but that's another story. So somebody said, Dr. Whitehouse, thank you for confirming my suspicions that the medical profession at large have their heads stuck. Yeah, you know, I sometimes say, have you ever heard that expression, that old expression that people suffer from hardening of the arteries? Hardening of the arteries, it means you've got buildup in your arteries and they aren't as flexible. So I think the doctors in our field suffer from hardening of the categories. They just can't get rid of the fact that they've got this one condition that they want to fix, and really a deep rethinking about what these words mean. And you know, the biggest reason for that rethinking is you all, some people on the call that have been affected by these labels, either yourself or in your families. When doctors use these powerful words, I think you all want the confidence that somebody has examined you and talked to you and understands your story and has medically looked for the things that can be specifically treated, but has a little bit of honesty about the fact that we're not quite so sure that medications are the whole answer. Somebody else asked the question, I've been on a medicine for 10 years, maybe related to a misdiagnosis or maybe just related to training. Fortunately, there's no evidence that the current generation of medicines do harm. But there is concern that these new, more powerful medicines that they want to use to dissolve amyloid in the brain, are going to have to be looked at carefully, particularly if we want to give them to people without symptoms who might take them for a long time. And yeah, this comment about lifestyle and exercise and stress reduction, I think that growingly we are coming to the recognition that if you want to improve your brain's health, there are things that you should do that we don't do enough of. And I'll tell you one story about this. But partly because we're putting all our hopes in medicines, we don't look at these other things. Now, let me talk about exercise for a minute. We are doing an experiment in Cleveland, which is fully approved by Ethics Review Committee and as part of the National Cooperative Study, where we are taking somebody's skin cells and infecting those skin cells with a virus that we think will do good, because that virus produces a substance that is important for growth function that's called nerve growth factor. We are using neurosurgery to inject those cells into the brains of people with mild symptoms with the hopes that those cells will produce more of that nerve growth factor and slow the progression of disease. Now, there are studies that show there is a little bit of an easier way to increase nerve growth factor in your brain, and yes, you guessed it all, it's exercise. So here's your choice. And, you know, some people might choose neurosurgery, particularly you diehard couch potatoes. But basically, there's a choice. You can have neurosurgery to put genetically modified cells into your brain, or you can get out there and do a little bit more exercise. And by the way, I'm a big believer in exercise. I'm also a big believer in turning on the music and doing a little dancing. I think dancing is one of the perfect therapies for dementia and a lot of other things that ail us as people. And yeah, we you know, this business between cure and care. What I'm really saying is that, well, let me ask you this question, folks. Let me ask, I'm going to point him out. Bill Feast, the Senior Vice President at the Alzheimer's Association, who's constantly talking about a cure. If we were to cure Alzheimer's, and believe you me, I'd love to have this kind of powerful, safe therapy, but if we were to have that, that means you would get rid of your Alzheimer's disease, because that's what cure means. It doesn't mean prevent. It means if you've got it, you get rid of it. Okay, let's say we cure Alzheimer's. What is your brain going to be like? Do you want to be cured back to a 50-year-old brain, a 45-year-old brain, a 35-year-old brain? Some of you might even go for adolescence. Or if you want to learn a foreign language all over again, you better go back to 8 years old. The point is that the brain is changing throughout our lives. And these changes overlap with the things we call Alzheimer's. And if you're going to cure something like Alzheimer's, it's a little like curing brain aging. And so what age do you want to pick to go back to? Let's see, we kind of got off onto the implications of these words. And the implications really have a lot to do with how we prioritize what we spend our money on. And folks, we're heading towards spending 1/5 of all our dollars, our gross national product, on healthcare in this country. And we are not doing a good job spending that money. We are wasting the money on a lot of high technology, a lot of expensive and relatively ineffective medications. I do not want the Alzheimer field to go down that line, because we have to spend that money to improve the lives of people and communities. The intergenerational school, where my wife and I started, is one such place, and I'll just tell you a story about that. But let's just pause one more time. I've been answering a few questions as we go along. I think it's working very well, Laura, from my perspective. Mm-hmm. But let's see where we are.
I think we're pretty much caught up. Brenda had another question. That's an interesting question about cure. Wouldn't the brain function at the age the person's at, or about prevention? And yes, Dr. Whitehouse does ask some thought-provoking questions, that's for sure. Yeah, I've never thought about what age your brain could go back to. And I was wondering, so if they have a cure for Alzheimer's, what about people with vascular dementia and frontal lobe dementia and Lewy body dementia and everybody else? So, right. You know, and all the overlapping. So if you have overlapping diagnosis, you get rid of one, and then what about the others you've still got? So, you know.
Right. Well, all good questions. And let me just say that, yes, you could go back to the brain, if you cured it. You could go back to the age your brain was when the cure had happened. But on the other hand, a cure isn't going to be instantaneous, and so we are talking about a moving target in terms of the biology. And if you cured somebody at the age of who already had a mild cognitive impairment, would they be stuck in mild cognitive impairment? Or if mild cognitive impairment really is early Alzheimer's disease, would you go back earlier because you'd want to cure mild cognitive impairment as well? I think the fact is that most people are talking about prevention. And unfortunately, people are still talking about prevention in terms of pills, whereas I think the prevention is in terms of creating communities that foster brain health. Yes, the mixed dementia question is a fascinating one. I think most people will say that by the time you get to be 75, or even perhaps younger, everybody has a mixed dementia. Everybody has some changes in their blood vessels and in their nerve cells. And if you look at a scan of the brain, the typical scan is read as showing shrinkage of brain tissue and what are called non-specific, meaning they're not very diagnostic of a stroke, but nevertheless showing changes suggesting that the blood vessels are getting old, as you might imagine. So the fact that most people really have a mixed dementia, and the fact that the brain that you have when you're 75 is the brain that you've developed throughout your lifespan. I mean, think about these poor veterans coming back from the wars with these injuries where they have traumatic brain injury, or for that matter, thinking about all the growing concern about professional athletes and football players where at a young age they have injuries to their brain. Those are going to affect how their dementia when they're later in life as well. So really, the end product of where you are with regards to your thinking abilities is not just processes that occur late in life, but processes that occur throughout your entire lifespan. The thought-provoking questions. Look, folks, at the end of the day, you may think that what I'm saying is not something you want to fully buy into. I think there is a growing field of other people that are, and I'm not saying I'm the first, that are raising these issues about the words we're using. I personally believe that these are thought-provoking, and that thought-provoking questions are good. Even if you don't agree with me at the end of the day, I do think, and I think many people believe, that this field needs a bit of a shakeup. So if I'm contributing to that, and if they announce a cure tomorrow, I don't think that it's a bad thing to ask these questions. So thank you for saying that. So let me end up my time by just describing the school that we started, and then leaving it open for some more questions. So I have increasingly felt that the medical approach to this problem is not adequate. When I was on the first National Alzheimer's panel, we were only asking for $1 billion. That was about 15 years ago now. And we kind of divided it up between the biological scientists and the others. And the scientists said, we'll take a half of that. We'll take $500 million, and we'll make a bunch of transgenic mice. Now, that was the day when we thought mice would be important. And by the way, now we're on to rats. I'll explain that in a minute. But, many people didn't understand the science. So, okay, we'll give the scientists $500 million to try to work on fixing it. Then we put $500 million into our healthcare system. Well, frankly, $500 million into our healthcare system isn't exactly a lot of money. And then you start fighting on how would you use that money to help with people with dementia. So the problem is improving care and improving communities is actually a more important goal, but it's a somewhat harder one than just feeding the mouse doctors more money. So the problem with mice is they don't get Alzheimer's. And the problem with rats is they don't get Alzheimer's either. Some of you may have seen the news recently that there's a new model which uses rats instead of mice. The rats, maybe they're a better model because they have plaques and tangles more readily. And the mice, we constantly struggled on getting them to have plaques and tangles and so on. I mean, at one point I was so pleased that we developed a treatment for the mice because, frankly, we'd spend all this time making demented mice and we had nothing to offer them. So we've done a really good job of developing treatments for demented mice, but if we stopped creating them in the first place, that would probably be the best thing. But we've learned that anything you read about mice, and I would say put in rats, that just doesn't necessarily convert to the human condition. So be very cautious about what you read about that basic science. So I came to the conclusion that I didn't want to take care of mice. I wanted to take care of people, and I wanted to start taking care of people earlier. Because as I said before, if you want to do lifespan prevention, you start with kids. Meantime, my wife, who's a psychologist that works with kids, said, we're having all kinds of problems with kids in school. And by the way, we could talk about an hour about labeling kids. It's the same kind of problem. We got an epidemic of attention deficit disorder and autism and all these kinds of things. And I'm not, people suffer and these labels have some truth to them. But the fact that they're getting applied to more and more people is to me worrisome. We have to ask similar questions about kids. But anyway, my wife and I got together and said, look, let's create a school where kids go to school with older people. It's also college students and nursing students and medical students. But some of our kids are challenged. They're from urban city, the city of Cleveland. They've had a rough go of it. And some of our elders have dementia. And we've published research with my friend Danny George showing that it's valuable for the people with dementia to come and learn with kids in schools. It's also, by the way, I should say, it's the highest performing charter school in the state of Ohio. The kids do well, partly because they're with elders and partly because that culture of learning is a respectful one where people behave. But here's the story I'm going to end with. There was, in our school, there are 224 children, and there are hundreds of part-time volunteers. And each year we give an award for the Volunteer of the Year. And needless to say, there are lots of people that are great volunteers. But a few years ago, we gave the award to a woman whose name I'll mention because I can mention with her permission, Mrs. Kelsey. And Mrs. Kelsey was standing next to her daughter as my wife was reading out her award as Volunteer of the Year award. She turned to her daughter and said, "Why am I getting this award?" And the daughter turned to her and said, "Mom, you come to the school every week and you volunteer and the kids love you." And Mrs. Kelsey said to her daughter, "I do?" Mrs. Kelsey's dementia, her memory problem was so severe that she could not remember that she volunteered on a weekly basis in the school. But needless to say, she was getting that award because her daughter was quite right. The kids loved her. She, in the moment, telling stories about her past, reading children's books to the school, was a profound contributor to our learning community, and she had a dementia. So the moral of this story for me is brain health, keeping yourself fit, whether you've got a label or you don't have a label, is much more about finding a sense of purpose and a community in which to express that purpose. And yes, our abilities change as we age, and yes, they change as we get into the depths of dementia, but still looking for how we can be part of our family, part of our community, and be contributing to that as best as we're able. It's the best thing you can do to prevent and treat what we currently call dementia and Alzheimer's disease. That was like a dramatic ending, so time for a few more questions.
Yeah, applause, definitely. Kathy Pemberton says she has to leave, but she'd like you to know that their entire senior living community, their company, Small Midwest Family Owned, is more or less modeled on the philosophy of your book, Living Life on Purpose. On your book, sorry. Living Life on Purpose is our tagline and the kind of culture we are growing. Thanks so much. Along the lines, there's been a few questions about, okay, so is it care? Is it exercise? Why are we on all these medications? What would the alternative be? Dementia-friendly communities. So Peter, I want to ask you, let's pretend that I had a checkbook and I pulled out my checkbook one day and I said, okay, Dr. Whitehouse, if you think you're so right, let's put your money where your mouth is, and I'm writing you a check for $1 billion. How would you spend that $1 billion?
So I think, I'm going to sound a little crazy again, that we cannot look at the problem of Alzheimer's disease in isolation. I sometimes quote Dwight Eisenhower, who said at one point, if you can't solve a problem, make it bigger. Now that sounds really strange, but what I am saying is that we have a lot of social problems in our society and health problems that go along with them. And I don't think that the Alzheimer's community can get away with advocating for this particular thing in isolation. I would love the Alzheimer's Association to say, yes, we take brain health seriously. We want to support the brain health of kids. We think that improving public education is a part of preventing late life dementia, so kids can help develop good habits early on. That we will go out there and advocate for the use of bicycle helmets. That we will go out there and advocate for getting rid of lead poisoning and other toxins that affect children's brains. So I would actually spend the $1 billion on developing health clinics in schools that focus on brain health and that create healthier communities. I would encourage those communities, for example, to grow local foods, to have kids avoid diabetes and obesity by learning how to eat healthily. And that's tough, as people know, in urban communities sometimes. And I would instill a sense of responsibility for the natural systems that support us as human beings. I believe that the greatest threat to people with dementia is, this may sound strange too, folks, global climate change. That is to say, the weather weirding, the changes in patterns of weather we're seeing who is vulnerable in our communities, kids and elders. Look at when Irene and Sandy hit New York. They didn't know whether to evacuate the older people in nursing homes or not. One time they did, the other time they didn't. Look at Katrina, who was hurt. So if we don't see the problem of late life dementia in the perspective of creating communities that are more responsible for their natural environment and more responsible for educating children, we will not use money wisely. $1 billion to solve that problem is hard, but CMS, the Committee for Medicaid and Medicare, that just put out $1 billion for innovation grants in healthcare. And I would like to do the same, but I would like to have those grants not focus on hospitals, not focus on doctors' offices, but focuses on how we can help schools, the essential part of communities that create a healthier lifestyle for all of us.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from CJ again. She was asking about what if you're misdiagnosed with Alzheimer's and if you've been taking medications for it. I don't know exactly which medication she's taking, but I assume it's the usual Aricept and the other medications. What is the possible damage on one's brain if you're taking those and you don't have AD?
And I tried to answer that question in passing by saying that the current generations of medicines like Aricept and I'm using the brand names here, and Exelon and Razidine and Namenda, don't appear to have bad long-term effects. I wouldn't say we've studied them long enough. And by the way, I wouldn't recommend anybody coming off medicines just because they've listened to me. This really is something that you should talk about with your poor primary care doctors. That they may or may not be as well informed as you are on these topics, but just, you know, this is not a call designed to get you to stop taking medicines. But the point I made that some of these new medicines that are in research now that will be given earlier and earlier, they could be quite dangerous if you took them for long term. So fortunately, the medicines that we have now don't appear to do much damage, any damage as far as we know, other than the fact that you may have wasted something out of your pocketbook. I'll mention one other thing in passing. Somebody was talking about autoimmune diseases. Everybody has their theories about Alzheimer's, and you know, I could have spent all hour listing all the theories. Scientists like that. They say, oh, we've got another hypothesis to test. But in actual fact, what all these theories mean is that whether it's autoimmune or inflammatory or antioxidants or whatever, probably there are multiple things going on in our brains, and that's why a single drug approach is not going to work, and why we need a multi-pronged approach to treating these conditions. Somebody said Richard Taylor is a great inspiration. I consider Richard one of my friends, and of course, close to the end, we should acknowledge what Laura described is, I'm sure, a difficult time for Richard and his family. But he's a hero. He's a character that is so articulate, and he's had the label for a long time. So Richard is by no means typical, because he's out there speaking articulately about the challenges, and he's not only representing himself, he's representing everybody. And he has great power because of his intellect, his personality, and his persistence, and his passion. So we all wish and pray for Richard for a speedy recovery.
Thank you. Rebecca from Houston asks if there's any proof that any of the current meds are helping.
Well, there is some proof. The FDA required that drugs that were approved for Alzheimer's demonstrate some benefit. The standard was pretty low. The standard was based on improving testing, which isn't, of course, the be-all and end-all, but also to try to have some effect on people's life. Unfortunately, in that category, they're rather minimal. And the trouble with the FDA studies are several. One is they're often done in people that don't have other health problems and have, kind of pure conditions. And so when the medicines come out into the general practice, where people are more typical people than the people that in research studies, they may not get the benefit. The other problem, frankly, is drug companies can afford to do lots and lots of studies and emphasize the positive ones and not emphasize the negative ones. We have a huge problem in our country that drug companies are fined billions of dollars for illegal and immoral behavior with regards to publicizing medicines, not the ones I've just mentioned, but, for example, the medicines to treat the behavioral problems, which is another whole topic. And they've just taken immoral and illegal behavior as part of their business model. They make so much money out of these drugs, and they have so much money to influence doctors and lawyers that this is a huge problem for us. The drive, as somebody said, to make a lot of money in this field, the quest for the Nobel Prize for Alzheimer's, or to make a lot of money out of a small biotechnology firm, it's a very great seduction. And I really feel as a doctor and a scientist that our field needs to not only wake up to the hardening of the categories, but to a certain extent to the hardening of the heartstrings. I mean, we're too self-centered around pushing this scientific agenda with fame and fortune attached to it. Yes,
Kathy. Sorry, no, go ahead.
I was just responding to the comment about from Sydney. Yeah, let's spread the word. We get back to this storytelling. I've told you lots of little stories along the way, but the positive stories about where things really have made a difference, that is really what we need to do. That there's so much doom and gloom. There's even a scientific paper written about the zombie language we use to describe people with dementia. Those of you with the label out there, be careful. You're a zombie. You're dead before you die. You're going to infect the rest of us. You're going to take over our streets at night. I mean, this is ludicrous. This is fear. This is not the positive message that we want to get out. Somebody mentions Japan. Absolutely, the Japanese, the Germans, they're really developing communities where attitudes are different, and we're not separating the world into people that have Alzheimer's that we call zombies and the normal people that don't have it. We're all in this boat together. This is a matter of solidarity, not separation.
I just wanted to mention that Kathy Greenblatt is a photographer, an extraordinary photographer and an author who published a book just over a year ago of photographs and stories called Love, Loss, and Laughter. And it's all about seeing Alzheimer's differently. And Kathy has photographed in places where one can view Alzheimer's, dementia, whatever label you want to put on it, growing older, in a very different way, and I highly encourage you to take a look for that on Amazon. It's called Love, Loss, and Laughter, and her name again is Kathy Greenblatt. It's really an extraordinary book if you haven't already seen it.
Right, and she's my friend from Palm Springs I mentioned earlier, and I've actually had the honor and privilege and fun of photographing with Kathy, so she's great.
Yep.
I think we probably have folks that need to wrap up at 2 o'clock here, is that right?
Yep, we probably do. Okay, there's some comments on thanks and everything, and living a life of dying some form of progress, that will always be foremost to be a person. Yes, to be a person, exactly. And I think we need to expand our image or our perception of what a person is. And we're pretty good with that in some areas. We're not so good about that with people with dementia. Mark Antoine, just one more question. On the topic of the changes in terminology with respect to dementia, would there be any impact on the use of the word Alzheimer's as well? So I guess, does that mean that Alzheimer's will fall into disfavor as a label, or do you think that's going to disappear?
I think that's hard to know. Clearly, the fact that they're trying to change the word for dementia, and clearly the new guidelines we talked about, are creating a sense amongst people that we are more confused about what the label means. Whether it means it'll go away, I don't know. The fact is, I think, and I've said this to many people in Alzheimer's associations, that the word Alzheimer's has lost a lot of its clinical and scientific meaning, but it's still a very powerful word in the public policy space. And so people are reluctant to give up with it because they want to go to the politicians and say, we have this thing that costs us a lot of money, and you've got to help us. The trouble is, when the help is more medicines, I think it's just too narrow an approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's up to you what happens to the labels. It's not up to just the doctors.
That's true. We need a groundswell, I guess. Thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate your words today. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And we'll see you next month on May 29th, or possibly sometime in between if maybe we'll do a meeting just for fun, just to get together and chat. Anyways, I'll keep you posted through our emails. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye.
You too. Bye.